So in this video I'm going to outline creating a strapless bodice pattern. So I am following along with the Winifred Aldridge method here, just so that people can have a reference. And so she does these adaptations on page 109 of her latest edition, the 6th edition of the Metric Pattern Cutting. There is no working drawing for it, unfortunately, so there is really no image of it, and here is the diagram there. It's only a small little bit, and the steps, and it's quite confusing because it relies on you having done the steps on previous diagrams, and even having done some steps that are all the way back on page 81, which is starting with the lingerie block. So I have traced the entire bodice block. I don't really need much down past the waist, so I kind of ended it a bit there. And so the very first thing to do when you're creating a strapless bodice is to do the adaptation from page 81 and create a lingerie block. So this is a regular block, and so it would have room under the arm. It would be assumed that it would sew to maybe a sleeve, possibly, in which case you leave lots of room there. So the lingerie block just basically means you take in the side seam. So you take it in 1.5 here, and you take that one in 1.5. You also take it in at the waist about 0.5 centimeters. Okay, both front and back. It just tightens it in because this block is a little bit loose-ish. They're certainly not form-fitting. Another thing that the lingerie block asks you to do is double the size of the dart. So it kind of has this diagram here. So when you trace off the block, you have a dart here, or wherever you have it. If it's in the neckline, it's fine, wherever position it is along the top. You just measure the amount of dart and come out the same amount next to it, one side or the other, and create a double dart. And why would we do that? Well, this part, again, across the chest on this regular body block is kind of loose. It's made for shirts or garments that wouldn't be really, really tight across here. So this takes out a little bit of the measurement. We've taken some out here and here, so it's tightening it up all along here, as we'd like our strapless bodice to be tight there, and it needs not to fall down. So we're tightening it in there. So that's what that does there. So there are the couple of steps I have done already. And so I'm just going to focus on this step. Okay, and so the last thing I did was I drew this line here. Again, it shows it there in the picture in terms of the lingerie block. Would be mainly for strappy dresses or strapless or whatever. So they're kind of cutting that block off along here. Okay, so I've just, rather than, because I'm not making the block, I'm kind of moving on then to making the strapless bodice. I just started with drawing this line here, which is for the kind of the top of the bodice. So how did I get that line? There would be a little variety in first of all, the shape you want to put on that line and where you place it. But generally a good amount to come up from this bust would be 7 centimeters. Okay, you could come up 8, you could come up 9 if you want. But maybe you could do just 6, it'd be quite low, but 7 is a good amount. So what I did was measured across to here. You can see a light line that I've drawn there. I squared across, and then I measured up 7 and marked it from there. I squared out, and then I folded over my pattern, because you don't draw through a dart. Okay. And when I did, I just placed a little mark so where this line would come to, and then I know that these will sew together, and I can then continue my line and graduate it into this position here. And now I'm just going to come across with this straight line across the back, and that will create the top of the back of the strapless bodice there. So coming from that point, and that should go right through the top of the back dart. Okay, so I've slightly darkened in some of these lines just to make them more obvious for the video. I don't usually darken my lines too much, but it just might help so people can see it. Now I'm going to wiggle through these lines, so that represents the fact that these are old lines that I started with and I've now moved in, and these are now my new measurement. So we're going to come back to Winifred, and in terms of the instructions she gives, she says to lower the waistline at the centre front of the lingerie block here by 1 centimetre. So you come down 1 centimetre, and you do this. The front of the body, of course, is different to the back of the body, and actually we tend to be kind of curved out that way in the front and curved in the back. So we tend to have a slightly longer measurement along the front. Not everybody, it is different, but just adding 1 centimetre tends to work out well. So that's what that's about. So you come down 1 and it comes all the way across into nothing at the other side of centre back. Okay, it then says complete the adaptations for the princess line petticoat. I believe it's now vertical seams. I think she's renamed it here in this new edition, but maybe it's been forgotten to rename it here. So it's these adaptations that are done here for this garment. So just notice you're coming in again another 1.5 on this kind of dart, or this shaping across the bust. So again, we really want to tighten this in. It needs to really curve up and over the bust shape. So we're taking another 1.5 off of there. And some of the adaptations there, drawing that in, which I've actually already done. And I believe that is it in terms of what that instruction there means. So I'll do that. 1.5. Marked in and drawn in. So again, this is gone now. And actually I should be sure and measure this line and this line to make sure that they match. In fact, maybe coming in first and then folding out, closing over the dart might be better. It still matches, so that's fine. So so she says then these are really the instructions. Again, there's only just a few, so it's a quick little pattern. Shape the back panel at centre back waistline. So we're talking about the back panel here. At the centre back waistline is here. And she says by 1 centimetre. So we're going to come in 1 centimetre here. And that's going into nothing at the back. Sorry, at the top, I mean. Okay, so now this is gone, and that's our new centre back line, but it's no longer on grain. So I'm just going to straight away put in a new grain line there, coming over from the centre back, just to remind myself not to forget. I need a grain line there. We'll also need it in the rest, but that might just remind me once I put one in. And then it says reduce both side seams by 1 centimetre on the top edge only. So we're going in a further centimetre. This makes it very, very straight along the top. Okay, so it might look strange. So we've come in 1.5 and now we're coming in a further centimetre on each side. And again, this is coming down into nothing really here. I mean, we did come in our original 0.5, but we're not doing a further adaptation on the waist at the side. Okay, again, I like to wiggle through. So keep remembering all of these are gone now. This is my final line. And again, for the video's sake, I'll just darken it a little bit so that it's really obvious. Okay. And then shape the waist of the front panel seam and on front and side front 1 centimetre. So this language can be a little bit tricky to understand. So what she's talking about, we're back here now to the front. Shape waist at front panel seam. This is the front panel seam. Okay, so there's going to be 2 panels in this, like here and here. So you imagine this is kind of like, look, the strapless is a bit like that, and we have this panel seam. On the side seam on front and side front. So what she's talking about here is this. You can see it in the little diagram. There is a dotted line where the shaping used to be, and now she has taken it in one. So we're talking about coming in one here, in one here. So taking it in means coming that way. Actually, I'm just remembering we didn't go down our 1 centimetre. I talked about it, but I didn't actually do it. So I'm going to measure that and do that now. Okay, and because that kind of affects this 1 centimetre thing. So I'm going to come in the 1 centimetre from here. I'm measuring it from the furthest out point, but I'm actually going to then drop it down because it needs to be down on this line. Okay, and coming back up. And so these are no longer. Okay, notice she does have this curved. I'm going to come back and kind of curve that. At the moment I just start with straight lines. Sometimes it's handy to start with straight and then we can curve them a little bit in. So then the last bit, marking points 1, 2, 3 and all this here, this creates a sweetheart shape here. So if you want that, you can go ahead and follow all those steps. I find that she tightens it even more, and I've found from fittings that it gets actually slightly too tight most of the time for most bodies that go into it from her adaptations. So yeah, so that's just what I find. I mean, the idea is that if you do come down here and create a shape, that kind of opens out, and so you're taking a little bit more out to compensate. But just a little warning on that, you know, it probably needs just personal adaptations for the individual body. Okay, so I'm skipping that. So really I am finished with my major adaptations. So I'm just putting in my straight grain. So again, straight grain is a line that's parallel to your center front or center back. All of these pieces are going to be so abstract when we trace them off and cut them out. So we really need our grain line, number 1, to help us cut and stay on grain. Know where we're at. So that center front line, it can be used as a grain in there. You can put one parallel line if you want as well, but these 3 definitely need it. And I think we're nearly there now. Just going to blend this line and curve it a little bit. So generally what you do, this is very pointy coming out for the bust and back in. So generally what you want to do is actually curve in a little bit here. So a couple of millimeters in. So giving a little more space where the roundest part of the bust is. You can nearly imagine or nearly draw it in there. And then you want to come in even another millimetre or 2 there, because just under the bust it's nice to come back in. And in fact that's too low really. You can just see by eye. Be more. And then you come back into nothing. So there's a kind of a shape like that. And so I think it's about sort of 1/3 if you really want to kind of measure. But with strapless bodices and things like this, they really are designed for each body. And at the end of the day, you really need to test and get all these kind of fittings down exactly when it's on a body. And so now I'm going to trace off all of these pieces. So I now have my pattern pieces traced off for each section of this strapless bodice. See them there. Okay, so I've traced them off and I have put seam allowance around each. I've traced down the straight of grain and I've put my labelling. The labelling is important, so I've just labelled with my name, the garment name, it's a strapless bodice, and then which part of the garment, so the centre front panel, side front panel, side back panel, and centre back panel, so that's what I've named them. All right, and then there's cutting instructions, which is important. You need to put this front one onto the fold of the fabric, so I'm cutting one to the fold in fabric, but I'm also going to be cutting a piece like this out in fusing, so I've just said cut one to the fold in fusing, and then the other three are cut two, and again there is a cut two in fusing as well, so we're going to fuse the entire strapless bodice to give it a little bit more structure. So now these pieces, once I cut them in fabric, could easily get very mixed up. This piece could first of all be turned upside down. In fact, it's quite common, people seem to think that makes more sense to sew those two shapes together, but actually it isn't the way they go. Okay, the body goes narrower in at the waist and it goes wider at the top, so we need to be sure to stick with our pattern pieces. So I need to put in some marks so that I have some notches, and so that when these get cut out in fabric I can tell which piece they are. So first of all I'm going to put in notches on the top to mark the top of the pattern. These are okay, I think, without the top notch because they are a shape and you can see it quite clearly, and that the bust is higher up on the top of the pattern. So I think these ones are okay, but I think these ones are very easily mixed up. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a notch, and I'm not measuring where this is because this is literally just a notch to say this direction up. Okay, so just place my pattern piece there and trace that notch through, and the same with the other one. And then the other thing I need to do is, some of them could be mixed up as to which side sews to the other one. So again, like this, when I cut it out in fabric, could easily be mixed up and sewn to the wrong side, and the grains would be out and various things. So yeah, so likewise that one could be sewn. So good to put in a notch here so that I know this one will sew to that, and then you know you can choose and put another notch on this side, so that you know this one sews to that one, or even one on the center back, so that this one doesn't get confused, because if you have a notch in the same place in each side you could swap it. So if you're putting a notch on this side and this side, be sure one is up and one is down. So that's what I'll do in this case. So I'm just going to choose a position, and that the notch can be, I can come from my straight of grain there, I can line my set square on, and I can just choose a position here and here, so they will match up. And then for this one I'm going to go lower. All right. The other thing you could do is do a double notch here and a single notch there. That makes it even more obvious. Maybe I'll do that just to kind of demonstrate it. And it might be a good habit to get into, because often you might just put all your notches along in a row, and then at least if that's a double and that's a single, you still won't get mixed up. So this piece has a lot of notches now. It has one telling you that it's up, one telling you this is to the side, and this is to the center back panel. So I'm going to trace in all of these notches now. Okay, so they're ready now to cut on fabric. So you just get your fabric, and it needs to be folded in half so that this one can go on the fold. Match up your straighter grains and then line these up with it, pin and cut out your fabric pieces. Now what I'm going to do for this demonstration is I'm going to use a silk fabric for the outside to be on silk, and in this case I'm going to line this strapless bodice with some silk dupion as well. For the demonstration purposes I'm going to use a different colour. If you were making it in real life you'd like to use the same colour, that way if any edge peeps over or out that it's matching. You could use a lining, but this garment would have boning in it, and it's nicer to have a more substantial fabric on the inside. It gives it a bit more body, gives it a bit more protection in between the boning seams and the body. So yeah, so now for lining, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a second pattern. So I'm going to come down a couple of millimeters here, say 2 mil all the way along here. You could do, I suppose you could do 2 to 4 millimeters along here depending on the thickness of your fabric, and then also along the bottom. And what that does is it means the lining pattern is slightly smaller than the outer pattern, so when you sew it together the lining fabric curves in and thus is less likely to peep out the front. And it will be a real test in this case because there'll be 2 different fabrics, and so hopefully it will be very clear. But that is best practice. Sometimes people skip that step if you're using the same fabric on the inside and outside. You know, you might get away with it, but it's important to know in terms of learning that generally speaking, if you're doing a piece that's inside, that's a facing, you take a couple of millimeters off the facing pattern so that the outside one definitely stays outside, it's larger, and the inside piece stays in and thus is less likely to peep out the front. So now I have, it might be a little hard to see in the video, but a line just a couple of millimeters down from the original line, and now I'm going to trace off second pattern pieces. So now I have cut out my lining pieces, pattern pieces, so they're just traced off along that 2 millimeter line and at the top and the bottom. So they're slightly smaller. Everything else is the same, grain line notches. Labelling is all very similar as well. I just have written on all of these lining, and I've even just used a highlighter. Just kind of helps very quick visual to distinguish these pieces from the other pieces. So I think that can be handy. And just notice that all of the seam allowances have extensions as well. Everything's been extended, and we will use a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance here and snip all of them so that we remember. Okay, and finally, just before we begin, just to say that, you know, depending on how you are closing or fastening this garment, you know, you may have something else going on around the center back here. You may, a common thing is to have eyelets and you would mark the eyelets in, the spacing of them. You might need to test it a little bit on the toile, and put it in. A lot of times then you can put an extra bit of boning where the eyelet is going to be, so that it holds it straight. So yeah, and that could go on the lining pattern. So there might be more things. Also, you might have another pattern. If you do have eyelets and you don't want any skin exposed, you might create a facing like 4 centimetre or even wider, so that it would fit a wider range of bodies, maybe 6 or 8 centimetre facing there. So there could be another pattern piece that would go there. And if there is a zip, it depends if you want that zip covered. If it's exposed, you could just leave it just like this. So this would be like an okay pattern for an exposed zip. But I suppose most of the time, actually, you might have the little flaps going over the zip, in which case you might want to extend the seam allowance, or, you know, kind of make it like a little flap that goes over yeah, the zip. So there's different things that could happen there at the back. As this is mainly a demonstration, just to give you the general steps, I haven't really specified. It's really left like there's a kind of a zip, an open-ended zip going in.